Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us this evening. It's wonderful to see such a large online gathering. Now, as many of you know, we have a tradition of marking Chester Beatty's birthday every year with a special lecture as a way of honouring his legacy in sharing his remarkable collections with the Irish nation and with visitors and scholars from all around the world. What Beatty regarded as his private library has today grown into one of Ireland's best loved museums. And the lecture always ties in with a theme relevant to the collections. And this year it develops on a theme touched on in our current exhibition, First Fragments, Biblical Papyrus from Roman Egypt, which was curated by Dr. Jill Uncle, our curator of Western collections. And I'm delighted that this year the talk also celebrates our new public holiday here in Ireland, St. Bridget's Day. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our invited speaker for this year's annual lecture, Dr. Sara Parks, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. Sara joined St. Francis Xavier University just in the autumn of 2022, and formerly she was Assistant Professor in New Testament at Dublin City University. Her PhD was in Early Judaism and Historical Jesus, and she teaches and researches the literature and artefacts of Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, with a special interest in gender, the history of women, and the dynamics of inner Jewish and anti-Jewish polemics. Her recent books are Gender in the Rhetoric of Jesus, that was in 2019, and Jewish and Christian Women in the Ancient Mediterranean, which she co-authored with Shana Scheinfeld. That was in 2022. This evening, Sara will speak to us about the fragmentary and lost stories of ancient women, whose contribution has been overlooked and erased in the past. And as we're going to hear, when it comes to ancient women's lived experience, almost everything about them is lost. I'm greatly looking forward to Sara piecing together their lives, bringing their stories to light for us from the fragments they've left behind. So thank you, Sara. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Chester Beatty, and to everyone gathering this evening online and in Dublin for the immense honor and pleasure of delivering the 2023 Chester Beatty Annual Lecture. I can just sense that everyone who's listening from Ireland is very refreshed and well rested, thanks to the shortened work week from the new St. Bridget's Day holiday. The timing of my invitation to deliver this lecture on lost stories of ancient women is probably not a coincidence. In fact, the figure of Bridget provides a perfect opportunity for a talk about the complexity and the creativity involved in uncovering women's histories, and about the reasons why women's stories can often end up downplayed or lost. Tonight, we'll talk about ways that historians of antiquity work through such questions when trying to piece together the lives of women from centuries ago. We'll also talk about the tendencies of institutions and individuals to remember and tell stories selectively. The decision to make St. Bridget's Day a holiday in 2023, over a century later than Patrick was given his bank holiday, was not spontaneous. It took hard work, especially by a group called Her Story, founded in 2016, who have taken up a fight against what they call the amnesia of women's stories. It was Her Story that petitioned to make St. Bridget's Day a national holiday. Tonight, I will share some stories that, like Bridget's, take some work to bring to prominence. They're off the beaten path of inquiry. They're not the winners of wars, the destroyers of competing narratives, the controllers of ancient mass media. They are not society's default human being, the elite male. Instead, recovering them takes both work and will. They survive in fragments. A 1,000-year-old tomb where the necklace that a female skeleton is wearing reveals her to have been a church leader. a tiny stone talisman for safety during childbirth. A scrap of a letter accidentally preserved 2 millennia in a garbage dump, urging a pregnant wife to expose the baby to die if it is a girl. Or right before our eyes in the New Testament, often skimmed over verses implying women's prominence. We have to dig for this evidence. It's often buried, but it is there if we're willing to remove that top layer of soil to uncover a rich, interconnected world of women's lives. I borrow this analogy from the world of mycology, the study of mushrooms. Biologist Merlin Sheldrake talks about how fundamentally different the methods for studying fungi are from those for studying animals and plants. In Entangled Life, he writes, "Microbial lives buried in soil are not accessible, like the bristling, charismatic, above-ground world of the large. Imagination is required." To borrow a phrase from Meredith Warren, a hermeneutic of imagination is exactly what's needed to uncover ancient women. Almost everything about them is lost, and what does reach down to us is heavily filtered through the perspectives of the few men that had almost all of the access to textual production. Another thing Sheldrake talks about in his book is the dichotomy between the typical mindsets of science, isolation, one question at a time, strict categories, clinical settings, and the messiness, interconnectedness, mystery, and sensorial interactions of fungal networks. Now, you may be thinking, is our speaker comparing women to mushrooms? Not exactly, but I am definitely saying that the methods for studying ancient women mimic those required for studying fungi in 2 important ways. 1, both data sets are largely subterranean or hidden and require some unearthing. And 2, neither data set can or should be easily pulled away from other topics and studied in isolation, but is instead entangled with everything else. When Sheldrake talks about barriers to scientific discovery in the study of fungi, there's some of the same barriers to the study of antiquity. A false belief that anything can be studied as a discrete category, and a dangerous overconfidence in the existence of objectivity. Yes, we might be able to arrive at an objective answer to a specific scientific question, but who designed the question? And which questions aren't being asked? Over the last 100 years or so, that overconfidence has been diminishing. We no longer think that unknown assumptions couldn't possibly be interfering in what we see, what we choose to look at and choose to ignore, and therefore what we conclude. That things like socioeconomic situation, nationality, skin tone, culture, religion, gender, power, mobility, class, don't have anything to do with the data we select as relevant, the way we interpret the data, the way we interpret the world. That our positionality is irrelevant. Positionality is the unique cluster of vantage points from which each person sees. For example, our position in relation to a book written in our own language that we hold in our own hands is different from our position in relation to a creature at the bottom of the ocean. Our difference from and distance from the evidence matters. The ancient Mediterranean is not only distant geographically from me, but the past is also different and distant conceptually. As linguists know, a different language is more than just a new vocabulary for the exact same words and things and concepts. It's almost always another way of categorizing experience and understanding the world. So just because we happen to have in front of us, say, a New Testament book, translated nicely into English with all the variants smoothed and punctuation added, does not mean we can then easily know what it means. Our positionality in relation to the past is further complicated by the dearth and distortion of the evidence. Most things from the past are lost. billions of conversations, jokes, births, griefs, weather events, recipes, plants, and songs are all irretrievable. And of course, it's not like the things that do remain to us are a representative sample, with texts, inscriptions, stories, and artifacts collected evenly from across all demographics. Instead, almost all of our ancient literary data are skewed towards the wealthy, urban, male, minority, rather than from the vast subsistence level majority. Archaeologically, the material remains more likely to survive are of sturdy materials used in elite households rather than wooden or woven materials used and made by women and non-elites. When it comes to the world of the written text, we almost exclusively have things written by men for men. This means our picture of the past is certainly distorted. We need to dig deep to find information from below, as historians say. And we accept that our findings are always tentative because of our skewed and gendered evidence. And let's not forget that our positionality also includes our disposition towards the evidence. Just as the evidence that has survived from the ancient world isn't neutral, neither are we. We're all positioned in a certain relationship to our questions. No one can escape this. Our experiences mean that we carry to the text our own hunches and assumptions, both known and unconscious. We're predisposed towards certain conclusions before we begin searching. We're conditioned to find some things important and not others. And this predisposition will affect which evidence we keep and which we discard, and what we make of it. There's nothing wrong with having personal and cultural dispositions. In any case, they're unavoidable. But as I tell my students, this doesn't mean we just give up. It means we work harder to become more aware of our assumptions. If we're aware of the non-neutral positionality of all researchers, then we can take it into account. One of the most important life hacks that the world has gotten better at over the last 50 years or so has been to ensure that voices from a variety of positionalities are included. Bringing in diverse voices isn't just a polite or ethical thing to do. It improves things a lot. It makes the job of discovering our hidden presuppositions much, much easier when we do it together. I'd like to share two examples of how the insights of someone who had a new positionality in relation to an old question saw through accepted conclusions and advanced society's knowledge in places where learning had been at a dead end. Sometimes things are only discoveries to those who weren't looking in the right places or looking very hard. Until recently, museums and textbooks the world over captioned busts of Roman women like this one with the explanation that Roman women's hairstyles were wigs. That the elaborate high hairstyles were always wigs was a widespread belief. This truism didn't meet with much interest or challenge until Janet Stevens, a hairdresser in Baltimore, was waiting outside for her child's music lesson to finish when it began to rain. She ran into the Walters Art Museum to take cover. While there, she saw many busts like this one. She observed neatly typed label after neatly typed label that described the women's hairstyles as wigs, explaining that they would be impossible to achieve with real hair. The hairdresser in her said, "Is that so?" At that moment, a Roman hairstyle archaeologist was born. On her next day off work, she tried her first Roman hairstyle on a mannequin. She wanted to use only tools and technologies available in antiquity, no hairspray or elastic bands. But she kept running into problems when it came to the evenness of the curls and the height versus weight of the high piles. She didn't give up though, and she eventually made the discovery that would come to change those museum labels. Through trial, error, and close observation, Janet realized what generations of previous archaeologists had overlooked. Needles, thousands of them. Found alongside hair combs, pocket mirrors, hair pins, and makeup pots. These little containers or collections found in women's quarters and women's tombs are often displayed in museums as beauty kits. The items will be individually labeled as, say, oxhorn hair comb, silver hand mirror, bronze tweezers, and bone sewing needle. However, I've often seen the beauty kits displayed in one museum case and then hundreds of needles found with them displayed in another section altogether as a collection of sewing needles. But what hit Janet Stevens was that perhaps the needles were so often found with hair products for good reason. The hairstyles were not wigs. They were the women's own hair sewn in place. These were hair needles. This resulted in Janet's first scholarly publication in the Journal of Roman Archaeology. Janet Stevens did not arrive at her now numerous academic publications, which can be categorized as field-changing, by getting a PhD and reading the literature. In fact, the literature all spoke about wigs. She came to her hypothesis from her embodied experience as a hairdresser. As a Canadian of settler descent, I am learning very belatedly about Indigenous epistemologies, or ways of knowing. We feminists are only recently coming to find words for what Indigenous peoples have always known, that experiential and embodied knowledge is a valid source of information. It took someone who physically knew human hair through her hands to say, these don't have to be wigs. Hair can do this, and it does it through the thousands of needles that were right there in hair kits the whole time. Indigenous methodologies also value story and orality. The assumption that unless something has been captured in writing, it can't be taken seriously is not one that all societies hold. There are many spaces, past and present, where what matters is transmitted orally. This is the reason why we don't really know very much about the workings of Greco-Roman mystery cults, for example. We may prioritize writings, but stories often hold the truth. For example, when the hashtag #MeToo took off, it became much more apparent that the official records that countries hold on file for sexual assault, a quarter of Irish women, a quarter of Canadian women by age 18, 2/3 of Indigenous women in Canada might be what's on paper. But we saw our colleagues, professors, administrators, lawyers, doctors, women from every level of society type hashtag #MeToo in solidarity with the very small percentage of sisters and brothers whose stories actually end up on record. The official statistics for gendered assault are bad, but if you've ever been part of a whisper network, you know just how many people who receive accolades, high salaries, public acclaim, promotions, prizes, professional honors are not safe to be alone in a room with. The whisper network is oral history. It may not be documented, but that doesn't make it any less true. This brings me to my second example of a time when a perspective outside academia got something right that scholarship had been ignorant of. In 2017, archaeologists excavated a settlement on the Pacific coast of Canada that showed signs of dense population in what turned out to be one of the oldest sites of human occupation on the west coast of North America. The items in the site, such as a stone hearth with particles of ash and carved tools, were dated to 14,000 years ago, Ice Age. But this settlement was not news to the Heitsak First Nation, whose oral history says this had long ago been a populous area. Listen to what William Hoosty, a member of the nation, says. Heitsak oral history talks of a strip of land in that area. It was a place that never froze during the Ice Age, and it was a place where our ancestors flocked to for survival. Now we don't just have oral history, we have this archaeological information. It's not just an arbitrary thing that anyone's making up. We have a history supported from Western science and archaeology. I feel sad when I see how Husti describes Indigenous oral history from a non-Indigenous viewpoint, just an arbitrary thing that someone's making up. He takes on the language of the colonizer when he implies that Western science and archaeology legitimize knowledge that came from Indigenous oral history, which was somehow not valuable. I know that even in Ireland, people have been hearing about the many unmarked burial sites of Indigenous school children across Canada, now being confirmed with tools like radar. These so-called Indian residential schools were designed by the Government of Canada and run by various Christian denominations from the 1870s to the 1990s. 1990s. Their stated purpose was to kill the Indian in the child and get rid of the Indian problem in a process of aggressive assimilation and intended cultural genocide that turned into literal genocide. I was sickened to see dozens of news stories and tweets minimizing, excusing, both sidesing, and even denying that the thousands of deaths had taken place. While it's true that not each and every priest, nun, or church worker was abusive and murderous, the system was designed to tear families apart and destroy Indigenous cultures and languages, and some languages are indeed now lost. But as the world debated just how bad the so-called schools were and pointed out that some of the radar readings were inconclusive without full archaeological excavation, what white people seemed to forget was that these graves were not discoveries to Indigenous people. Canada is full of living Indigenous people who remember, who saw their classmates get into trouble and disappear, starve, get thrown down the stairs, thrown in the river. In fact, as a part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, many of them told these stories, and the numbers of disappeared little children that they remembered ended up coinciding with the now 6,000 or so little graves. Evidence for ancient history may be fragmentary and distant, but this is recent history. And yet, if that recent history exists only in oral memory, did it happen? Anishinaabe storyteller Lenora Kishig Tobias says the people who have control of your stories, control of your voice, also have control of your destiny. I know we're supposed to be talking about ancient ladies, but the best thing about contemporary feminism is that it is not interested in only working towards equity for cisgendered white women, although we too have our struggles. It works toward the dismantling of patriarchal and kyriarchal systems in which only a very small group of rich men pillage and destroy the flourishing of all cultures, all genders, and all places. When it comes to tonight's topic, we don't have living ancient women we can interview who remember. Those oral histories are gone. Colonialism, and I include patriarchy as a manifestation of colonialism, always erases some things that can never be gotten back. We as historians have to ask ourselves, when we lack ancient oral stories and only have texts, whose voices are we missing? Women leaders, busy leading their vibrant communities rather than busy writing gospels like the men? I think so. But we do have some fragments that have come down to us that point to exactly that. For instance, we have a Jewish queen, Salome Alexandra, in the Hasmonean dynasty. Between the books of the Maccabees and the works of Josephus, we can piece together that when her husband, the king, died, she assumed power and reigned for a decade, undertaking military expansion of her territory, launching the Pharisees to prominence, and possibly authoring or authorizing several books with Jewish female protagonists. We also have reports of Jewish women carrying out a mass political protest. In the book of Second Maccabees, it's easy to miss a short passage where Jewish women protested a violation of the temple by thronging the streets, wearing sackcloth wrapped around them under their breasts. So they orchestrated a massive topless march to protest religious oppression with significant danger to their lives. It's also easy to miss the passages in the Gospels that hint that women were a much larger and more important part of the group that traveled with Jesus than we tend to think of when we hear the words Jesus' disciples. As sources, the Gospel writers don't seem particularly favorably disposed to women, and in some ways they work to diminish women. Yet they all include the tradition of a substantial female cohort within Jesus' core working and traveling group, as though they have no choice but to admit that it was women who supported the group. And before you assume that providing for Jesus meant something like making sandwiches for Jesus and the boys, there's no hint in the Greek text that it means anything other than financing. These verses form one textual cluster out of several that hint that women were a backbone of Jesus's movement. And of course, 2 or 3 decades after Jesus' death, Paul's letters reveal that he had obviously inherited a movement filled with important women who were there before he was. A movement with men at the top and women as accessories is what we might picture, and what the texts and their interpreters might very well want us to picture, but what a careful reading seems to deliver is a movement largely powered by women. Mary Magdalene is a fascinating example of an influential woman whose own voice is lost and whose retelling by men gets entirely twisted. She's referred to several times across all 4 canonical New Testament Gospels, and she also pops up as an important figure in later apocryphal texts that clearly value her highly, so much so that many scholars propose that she must have been a leader of similar status to Peter and Paul, whose importance and memory were purposely diminished, which was possible, in my opinion, because she didn't write. Non-canonical texts like the Gospel of Mary, the Dialogue of the Savior, the Gospel of Philip, the Pistis Sophia, and others show that a number of early Christian groups remembered her as an apostle, a visionary, and as Jesus's preferred dialogue partner. As one of the few women followers of Jesus for whom there is a substantial body of intriguing historical references, we can trace her transformation over time from an important financial supporter and close confidant of Jesus into the wildly divergent reception of Mary Magdalene as a penitent prostitute. Chances are, whether or not you're familiar with Christianity, some images come to mind when you hear the words Mary Magdalene. You might picture the Renaissance paintings that show her remorseful and weeping, usually in a tattered, revealing dress, or no dress at all. Universally, artists have rendered her as young and sexually alluring. Her most frequent appearance in the long history of Western art is as the penitent Magdalene. Images of her as the sex worker who repented and became Jesus' dearest follower or lover are well known. There's only one problem. There's no historical evidence for any such image. From the 8 gospel passages in which she is mentioned, there is quite a lot we can glean. The way she met Jesus was probably the incident where she went to see him about healing from 7 demons, which, by the way, doesn't necessarily imply any kind of sinfulness at a time when demons were the science. Headaches were demons, toothaches were demons, mental illnesses were demons, losing things around the house was demons. So when the text says 7 demons, with 7 being a number symbolizing wholeness in Judaism, it is simply saying she was very sick. She must have actually experienced healing because she was inspired to join Jesus' group and travel with him, and also to donate substantial funds. We know she was in the innermost circle because she's one of the very few followers who stayed around during Jesus' arrest and execution. She's mentioned in connection with his burial proceedings, which are often taken care of by close family. The 4 resurrection accounts in the gospel differ quite substantially, but Mary Magdalene is one of the only constants. She's portrayed as the first witness of the resurrection and the one who first carried the message about it, meaning all the traditions essentially credit her with the reforming of the Jesus movement after he was killed, even if they paint different pictures of how it happened. At no point in her time with Jesus do we learn of anything she would particularly need to repent for. It is incorrect to conflate Mary Magdalene with the quote unquote sinful woman who washes Jesus' feet. That woman, referenced in Luke 7:36-50, is unnamed, while Mary is always a named character in Luke. The association of both those women with sex work came in the 6th century when Pope Gregory suggested it in a sermon that conflated the two unrelated New Testament women and declared them prostitutes in a persisting image that serves to sexualize her and distract from her elevated role. While we don't know Mary Magdalene's age, we do know from the Gospels that she was wealthy, independently of a man. So it's not likely she was very young. It's more likely she was a widow. Furthermore, Magdalene means tower, a formidable and meaningful nickname that presumably was given to her by Jesus, who often nicknamed his disciples. If she were a leader, she was not alone. Although at the turn of the 1st century CE into the 2nd, we begin to see very harsh anti-woman Christian literature begin to develop, some of which made it into the New Testament, this doesn't mean that Christianity was monolithic. There are many ancient tombstone inscriptions, pieces of art, elements of church decoration, tirades against women, priests, and bishops, and other kinds of evidence that prove that early Christian women had leadership roles alongside men. But the winners of history took pains to hide that information. For example, here's a chapel mosaic from the 800s that shows 4 women. The one on the left has a square halo or nimbus to indicate she's still alive. Above her is the inscription Episcopa, which means bishop and is feminine. But beside her, going downwards, is the name Theodo. Ali Katutz points out that the O is a masculine ending, but Theodo isn't a real name. The gold tiles below Theodo are brighter than those around them, indicating they are newer. It would seem that they were added to cover up the full name. Theodora, a feminine name, which would explain why the word bishop is feminine here too. Apparently, someone didn't like a reminder that there had been women bishops. These types of cover-ups continue to happen, sometimes by academics in our own guild. What would you think if I showed you the following inscriptions and said that they were found in locations that pretty firmly suggested they're connected to the early Roman cult of the goddess Isis? The first one reads, Marin, priestess, good and a friend to all, causing pain to no one and friendly to your neighbors, farewell. Approximately 50 years in the 3rd year of Caesar on the 13th day of Pauni. So she died around age 50, around Caesar Augustus, around 28 BCE. The second one reads, here lies Gaudentia, priestess, 24 years, in peace be her sleep. You probably wouldn't think much of it because we have an expectation that women regularly took on important cultic roles in Greco-Roman religions. But what if I told you these inscriptions were on the tombs of ancient Jewish women? The first one was found among 80 other Jewish inscriptions in a Jewish necropolis. The second features an exceptionally clear drawing of a menorah, probably the clearest I've ever seen, and a Torah shrine. These are just 2 of dozens of such inscriptions ranging over a wide area and spanning numerous centuries that name Jewish women as priestesses, heads of synagogue, mothers of synagogue, elders, and so on. You can read them all for yourself, conveniently located in one place. Here, Bernadette Bruton published them all together along with her biting commentary in 1982 in Women Leaders in the Ancient Synagogue. It was republished in 2020 online with open access. If you take the opportunity to read it, you'll see that it destroys the old assumption that unlike all other religions in Greco-Roman antiquity, Judaism had no female religious leadership. If you don't know the story of this book, you might assume that it went something like this. Step 1. First, people believe there are no religious leaders, women religious leaders in ancient Judaism, because this is the implication in priestly instructions in the Hebrew Bible. Step 2, then Bernadette Bruton's diligent archaeological efforts unearthed for the first time numerous clear inscriptions from a wide variety of early to late Roman era sites that rock the world by providing a mass of unequivocal evidence for women leaders in Jewish antiquity. No one can argue because the inscriptions are not in bad condition, but are easy to read and are all in context marked undeniably as Jewish. And their impressive number shows that they're not a one-off anomaly, but a frequent occurrence. Even if other ancient Jewish texts do assume women cannot be priests, or even actively oppose it. Step 3, from then on, scholarship takes the new evidence into account and understands that there were diverse Jewish practices and sometimes women leaders. But that's not how the story goes at all. In fact, Bruton is not an archaeologist. These inscriptions were not new. The first one I mentioned was discovered in 1922. So why did we not hear about ancient Jewish women synagogue heads, priests, and elders until Bruton's book in the 80s? Well, let's have a look. The man who discovered the first one, C.C. Edgar, helpfully explains that in this case, the word priestess can't mean what it says because the woman is Jewish, and so it must mean that it's her father's name. Her father's name is priestess. That's normal. The second inscription is described by various interpreters as meaning the wife or daughter of a priest, with explanations like, quote, "It could hardly point to a priestly function for a woman since no priestesses are to be found in the Jewish worship, except all of the dozens of inscriptions where they are to be found." The subtitle of Bruton's book is Inscriptional Evidence and Background Issues. I think you're starting to get an idea of which background issues she means. The hilarious lengths to which commentators have gone in order to avoid the plain sense of the words wherever Jewish women have leadership positions. For example, there are 3 clear inscriptions that use the word synagogue head for women, archysynagogos. They're not ambiguous. There's one on a burial site that says Rufina, a Jewess, Judea, synagogue head, built the tomb for her freed slaves and slaves. No one has the right to bury anyone here. If anyone dare, they pay 1,500 denarii to the holy treasury and 1,000 denarii to the Jewish nation. A copy of this inscription is in the archives. Bruton traced the history of scholarship on this epitaph and found that Salomon Reinach, who first published the inscription, said the title must just be honorary and can't mean what it usually means because it is referring to a woman. Another writes that Rufina was very likely a lady whom the congregation wished to honor, but to whom it could hardly have entrusted the actual charge of an office. Another concludes, concerning the women, it can certainly not mean that they were bestowed with the dignity of a head of synagogue, for the synagogue did not allow women such honors. The sheer mass of Bruton's collection of scholars who do not once bother to argue for their unnatural and awkward readings of the evidence is telling. Bruton points out if these inscriptions had come from another Greco-Roman religion, no scholar would have thought of arguing that priest does not really mean priest. I want to say that times have changed, and now we all know that there were a range of different options for Jewish and Christian women in different ancient communities, but it's actually not the case. My colleagues in gender studies and women's history know about Bruton's work, but most students are still taught that unlike other religions of Greco-Roman antiquity, Judaism had strictly male leadership. Even worse, people still contrast this stereotype of Judaism against early Christianity, using the false and dangerous trope that ancient Judaism was hopelessly patriarchal until Jesus came along and emancipated everyone. We know from the evidence that this isn't true. I want to shine a light on a savvy ancient Jewish businesswoman we only know about through a lucky accident. In the 1960s, in a cave in the Judean desert, a stash of documents was found that turned out to date from the 2nd century, and that were mostly related to the Second Jewish Revolt against Rome. Among this important evidence for the Bar Kokhba revolt was a tightly wrapped bundle of papyri we call the Babitha archives, a set of documents belonging to a woman of that name. Among the bundle are personal effects that show that Babitha owned substantial pieces of land, which she managed for profit, was wealthy enough to lend money, and was ambitious and knowledgeable enough to take people to court when financially slighted. From that bundle, we can piece together that Babitha was born around 100 CE to a family that owned date orchards. When her father died, he left the estate to her. By the time of the earliest document found in the bundle, Babitha had already been married and had a son named Yeshua, and her husband had died. At his death, a Roman court had apparently appointed guardians for the son, because this is a legal record of her litigation against them. It states that she did not think the guardians were investing in her son's estate in a way that would produce the sort of income he should expect. So she was taking them to task. She married again to one Judah, who had another living wife, Miriam, and a young adult daughter. We learned that she lent her new husband a substantial sum of money to pay for the daughter's wedding. 2 years later, he died, and we learned from the documents that since she had not been paid what was owed her, she seized her husband's date crop. Another legal battle, this time with her co-wife Miriam, ensued over their late husband's assets. The last dated document of the Babitha archive is from 132, which overlaps with the beginning of Bar Kokhba's uprising against Rome. We don't know what happened to her, or why her documents ended up with a cache of revolt documents. It is possible that she became a financial patron of the revolution. The Babitha archive is incredibly important because it shows that while many male-authored literary sources describe Jewish women as living completely under a man's control, this accidentally uncovered trove of evidence tells a different story. Babitha inherited, owned, and managed property. She went to court to dispute her son's guardianship and to receive money owed her. She lent large sums of money and possibly donated to a political movement. The Babitha archive is one of those fragrant whiffs of the mycelial network of women's history. But it also reminds us how suspicious we have to be of literary sources written by men that depict ancient women as submissive and demure. As Bruton says, one must distinguish between the history of women and the history of men's attitudes towards women. Speaking of discoveries that were not really news to those who knew, at some point in the 20th century, society seemed to realize that women are people. Of course, some of the people had actually already known this, but when others learned it and women became professional researchers, our differently socialized perspectives and different experiences magicked new information from the same old artifacts and texts. Lost women's stories began to be retold, as did the rest of the stories of ancient men, because now ancient men are studied not as default humans, but as gendered humans as well. But there are things we can still improve upon. I've written about something called the Bruton phenomenon. Those inscriptions cataloged by Bruton and others have still not really been integrated into our basic picture of ancient synagogues. The mosaic and other art inside Christian spaces that clearly show women officiating are likewise not well known. It's common for scholars to bracket out work on women and gender as something optional and continue working within a limited scope that assumes its own neutrality, but its choices are actually weakening and harming historical accuracy and contemporary flourishing. The fact is that when we continue to embrace patriarchal definitions of what is professional and view work that takes gender into consideration as niche, we will continue to get discoveries that are old news, like the discovery of America or the discovery of unmarked graves of Indigenous children, as well as discoveries that could and should have happened a long time ago, like the discovery that Mary Magdalene's sexuality was nowhere near as interesting as her power and influence, and the discovery that all of these hair kits with random sewing needles were actually hair kits with unrandom hair needles. When we're faced with a task so tricky, like that of unearthing ancient history in a way that respects its people and all people, we could borrow some methods from our mushroom expert. Remember that most things are hidden. Everything is interfunctional. Appreciate the literature, but also valorize knowledge that comes from the senses and embodied experience, the imagination, oral histories, different expertises, and different positionalities. And you just might be rewarded by unearthing something tantalizing. Thank you.